I'm Renee Williams.
And I'm Billy Thomas.
And welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. You know, Billy, Kentucky is like rich in diversity. It's like that we have bottomlands, we have hills, we have mountaintops, we have, tiny little mouse creatures all the way to a big elk. It's diversity in wildlife and land. It's just diverse.
It really is, and a lot of that, we're fortunate here in Kentucky. We have so many different kind of habitats and different elevations, and that really permits a lot of different wildlife and other plants to thrive here in the state. And today's show is going to be featuring one of those regions, the Knobs region of Kentucky, and that is Andrew Berry is going to be covering that for us. He's with Bernheim Arboretum, and the Knobs is a really interesting region, kind of surrounds the inner bluegrass, but we'll learn more about that. And then we also have Zach Hackworth. Zach is a research forester here in the Department of Forestry. He's actually working on his PhD right now, and he works on a wide variety of projects. And one of the projects he's engaged in is ravens and how they're kind of coming back into Kentucky, or have been over time, and he's got a pretty neat citizen science project he's going to be talking about here in a little bit. So I'm really excited about today's show. If you are joining us via Zoom, you can use the chat function to interact with us, and if you're on Facebook Live, you can use the comment section and we can interact that way as well. But I'm really excited to be here, and thank y'all for joining us today.
And welcome back. We didn't have you last week. You were missed, definitely.
Yeah, I was down at a really neat workshop. Dr. Jacob Muller on our team was putting on a workshop on dealing with climate change and woodland management here in Kentucky. So it was a good educational opportunity for me.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we're glad you're back.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to be back. And, and I think it looks like we might be having a little bit of trouble with Andrew not being with us right now. I think he may have dropped off on his internet. So Renee, I don't know if you want to switch over and go ahead with Zach.
Let's go ahead and get Zach rolling.
Okay. All right. So, folks, we're going to go ahead and get Zach Hackworth. Zach, unfortunately, could not be with us today. He's out in the field, actually doing some field work. But he put together this really nice presentation for us on, ravens here in Kentucky and Appalachia. So, without any further ado, Renee, I'll go ahead and get that rolling.
Yeah, sure. I've always wondered the difference between crows and ravens. So, hopefully, he'll explain that a little bit.
Hi, folks. I'm Zach Hackworth. I'm a research forester with the University of Kentucky Department of Forestry and Natural Resources. And I'm excited to be with you on the podcast today to talk about just an amazing species of bird that we have here in Kentucky, the common raven. And the raven is a species that not a lot of people know about. And in fact, it's a relatively new species to the state, not historically, but in more recent decades. And so my hope with this segment of the podcast is to give you some ways that you can identify ravens, and also to give you a little bit of history on the recolonization of ravens to the state, and some of the ongoing research that we've got going here at UK. So inevitably, whenever I mention ravens, the first response of people is always ravens. Oh, you mean crows? You're just talking about a large crow, right? But in fact, ravens and crows are two different species. Even though they might look very similar on the surface, both being relatively large black birds, they are indeed two unique species. And they have two unique sets of life history strategies and ecologies. So the first thing I want to do is give you some ways that you can identify differences between the two birds. So on the surface at the outset, ravens are very large birds. They stand upwards of about 2 feet tall, weigh upwards of about 4 pounds, and have a wingspan of about 4 feet. Whereas in comparison, crows are much smaller, stand only about 21 inches tall, weigh about 1 pound to 1.5 pounds, and have about a 3-foot wingspan. So comparatively speaking, ravens are much larger birds. Some identifying features between the two. The easiest way to tell the difference between the two is to look at the head. So common ravens have a very large beak. It almost looks disproportionate to the size and shape of their head. So that beak is predominantly covered in feathers, with those feathers extending typically over halfway along the length of the beak. Crows have this feature as well, where they have feathers growing out on their beak, but the extension of those feathers is certainly much less than on ravens. Another way that you can tell the difference is by looking at their throat feathers. The throat feathers, or the hackles, on ravens are very pronounced. You can see how those feathers are very fluffed up. Whereas on crows, those throat feathers generally lay quite a bit flatter. If the species are in flight, you can tell that a bird is a raven by looking at the shape of its tail. Ravens have what we call a wedge-shaped tail, meaning that it's wider in the middle and comes to a little more of a pronounced point at the tip, compared with crows that have a fan-shaped tail, or a more typical hawk-shaped tail, where there is no prominent point. It almost approximates a semicircle. One very easy way that you can tell the difference is by listening to the vocalizations. So everybody is probably very familiar with the common call of a crow. Again, let's remind ourselves. Right, so that's a common crow call that you've heard probably in your backyard or in your woodlot. But ravens sound quite a bit throatier, and it's more of a cronk call. So let's hear that. All right, so ravens have a cronk call. It's very deep. It's very throaty. You can pick out single individual notes, very different from the caw sound of the American crow. And their ecologies are different. So common ravens, when they're selecting nest sites, will generally build their nests on cliffs. And that's a common hallmark of ravens. Even though they do build their nests on in larger trees or on certain human structures, they like to nest when available on cliffs, as opposed to crows that are very happy with building their nest in trees or shrubs. Thinking about foraging, common ravens are almost predominantly scavengers, meaning that they forage on carcasses of dead animals, whereas crows are a little bit more omnivorous. They'll eat some fruits and nuts in addition to animal meat. So after I give people a little information about the species, their first comment or reaction to me is, wow, I didn't know we had those in Kentucky. And a lot of people don't. And a lot of people are surprised to find that they're even in the eastern U.S. at all. But this is the range map of ravens. And we can see that ravens are found predominantly all over the West, all over the western U.S. and in parts of New England and in parts of Appalachia. But in fact, prior to the arrival of European colonists, ravens were found all over North America. Anywhere that there was forest, ravens were typically found. And even in places where there were not forests, like in the Great Plains regions. So if we look back at our range map, we can see that there's places in the Midwest and in the Great Plains where ravens are not found today. But in fact, they were found all over the Great Plains regions, because there were reports that they followed buffalo herds around and scavenged on carcasses. Again, a very large source of food for them. So again, anecdotal information from Native American cultures, from findings of bones from archaeological sites all across the U.S. and Mexico and Canada that indicate that ravens were widespread all over the continent prior to the arrival of Europeans. However, after the arrival of Europeans, there was quite a bit of deforestation, land clearing for agriculture, commercial hunting of buffalo, of deer, of elk, of all the major food sources for them, as well as targeted persecution of ravens. So again, ravens, even today, are considered agricultural pests. So targeted poisonings to remove ravens, direct shooting of them, all resulted in a pretty significant decline of raven populations in the eastern U.S. up until about 1950. But luckily, starting in about 1950 and in successive decades, we started to see ravens becoming more abundant. Sources of food for them became more prevalent. Deer populations began to recover. Elk populations were started to replace the extirpated eastern elk, and common wildlife laws such as the Migratory Bird Act afforded protection to the species, and creation of national parks and national forests helped preserve habitat for them. So up until about 1950, they were declining, but starting in 1950 and afterwards, we started seeing them becoming more prevalent. And up till about 2000, 2010, ravens were very under-recognized as species that were recovering. There was a lot of anecdotal information of saying, oh yes, we're seeing more ravens, but there were no formal studies that tracked recolonization of the species. So that was one of the things that we were interested in doing from a research perspective. We wanted to track the recovery of this species in terms of its recolonization of its former home ranges, of its former range. So what we did was obviously there were no modern technology databases present in 1950 like there are now. So what we did was we searched bird atlases, we searched publications of ornithological societies, we searched data from formal bird counts of surveys, we used online forums that were available in later decades. We even conducted personal interviews with people who saw ravens 20 and 30 and 40 years ago to compile this database of raven sightings between 1950 and 2016. And so what we did was we took those sightings, we put coordinates to them as good as we could, and we tracked range expansion by decade. And so this figure shows our result. The top panel shows the decade estimate of raven range in central Appalachia, while the bottom level shows the individual sightings. And so if we look at the individual sightings in 1950 and 1959, we can see that ravens are found predominantly right along the core mountainous areas of central Appalachia. But in successive decades, we see that there's expansion along the Appalachian mountain chain. But in decades later on, in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, we can see westward and eastward expansion into lower elevation areas until finally, by about 2016, we see that ravens have completely infilled all of the range in central Appalachia and are very common in the Appalachian region, which was very encouraging to find. In Kentucky, the patterns very much are similar to other states in the region. However, we are right on the sort of southeastern extent of the ravens range. But we can see that in this map, which shows all the sighting locations known for ravens, that ravens are becoming fairly prominent, especially in the southeastern parts of the state, around Harlan and Letcher. But even across all of eastern Kentucky and the Cumberland Plateau, ravens are becoming abundant, and they are increasingly abundant every year. And I always tell people not to be surprised if they see a raven anywhere in Eastern Kentucky, because it certainly is a possibility that ravens are out there and they're in areas that we don't know about. Okay, they're increasingly found every year in new areas. So that's very encouraging to see from a conservation standpoint for these species. So going forward, we know that ravens are becoming increasingly abundant in the region, but unfortunately, because they are newly abundant in the species, we haven't had the opportunity to do a whole lot of research on their regional ecology. Okay, we don't know specifically what types of habitats they are inhabiting in these regions, what things they're eating, and how successful they are at reproduction. So all of those things are important for conservation, and all of those questions are answered beginning with effective monitoring programs. So we have to be able to survey these species to know where they are, to be able to do these more in-depth studies on them. However, ravens have been characterized typically as wary species and very distrusting of humans, and that's potentially a holdover from the persecution in previous centuries. So our research question that we set out to answer was, how do we design surveys for such a cryptic species? How do we estimate their detectability? How do we determine how detectable they are, given the fact that they are so cryptic? So what we decided to do was to find cliffs with known raven nests on them. And what that allowed us to do was that allowed us to estimate how detectable the ravens are in areas where they are occupied, in areas that they occupy, in areas where they are present. So what we did was we surveyed 24 cliffs across Central Appalachia, Kentucky, North Carolina, West Virginia, and Virginia. And during each one of the surveys, we recorded the amount of time it took until we detected a raven. And what this did was this allowed us to estimate how detectable the species was when it was present. And so what we found was that on average, ravens are very detectable despite what was originally thought about them being distrusting of humans. So they do readily disclose their presence when they are there. So on average, we waited about 14 or 15 minutes until we saw ravens during a survey. Okay, so that was a whole lot lower than we expected to find. And in fact, all detections occurred within the first hour of the survey. So on the right, you can see what's called a detectability curve, where on the x-axis, the x-axis is the survey time, and on the y-axis, we have detection probability, which is the probability of detecting the species during a survey, with 0 being that it's impossible to detect them, and 1 being that they're always detected. And so we can see that in the first 10 to 20 minutes of the survey, detection probability increases very quickly, which is indicating that ravens are very detectable. They're relatively detectable, and that it approaches 1 at about 60 minutes. So, so again, that indicates that ravens are very detectable. And this was a finding that we were not expecting to see, which is a good thing. A finding that we also uncovered in this study was that ravens are sensitive to disturbance at the nest. So even though they are detectable, they are still sensitive to human presence around their nests. So in general, the farther away that the observer was from the cliff, the higher detectability was. So basically, ravens, when the observer was closer to the nest, raven detectability was lower. So basically, they called less, tried to move less to minimize being observed by the surveyor, which is again not all that unsurprising. So what that tells us is that ravens are highly detectable, but they are sensitive to humans. So in general, we are cheered by this finding, and in that they don't appear to be as elusive as we previously thought. So creating surveys for them may not be as difficult as we originally thought, which is great for conservation of the species. So what are some things that you can do to help with conservation of ravens? So ravens, again, are a very new species. So a lot of people might want to go and try to find them. When they hear about raven sightings, a lot of people might try to flock to these areas. The first and foremost thing that you should think about when birding is that you need to try to avoid disturbing the birds in general, but try to avoid disturbing them at their nest. Okay, so our research shows that you need to stay at least 100 yards from that nest when you're observing, and that it doesn't matter if you're on top of the cliff where the nest is, or if you're underneath of the nest, it doesn't matter. They are sensitive to both of those. So you need to stay at least 100 yards away from the nest if you can, and try to remain as concealed as you possibly can. So if there's a forest edge, try to tuck yourself up in that and stay out of the open as much as possible, because they are sensitive and they are very good at detecting you. Perhaps a lot better at detecting us as we are of detecting them. So if you observe a raven, it would be great if you could try to photograph it or record it, record audio, and then upload that information to eBird. And what that'll do is that'll help document the location of that bird and help future research efforts down the road. Now this is important, if you do discover an active raven nest, so you identify ravens and you can identify that they have a nest, we ask that you do please contact Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. And what that will help us do is that will help us to document that nest, and that will enable us to study them further and allow us to estimate some reproductive parameters for them in the state. So I've included the URL for Kentucky Fish and Wildlife county contacts. So that's a lookup tool. You can find your county and see who would be the appropriate people to contact to come and survey a raven nest. Conversely, if you can't find a county contact, then you can contact me, and I will help to bridge that gap for you. So again, just to wrap up, ravens are spectacular creatures. And again, we're very common in Kentucky, in all parts of Kentucky, but faced some challenges for a long time. But it's great to see that as a species, they're recovering and becoming more prevalent in the state. So if you have any questions about ravens or would like to discuss anything further about any information that was presented, I do encourage you to contact me, and my email address is on the screen. I would be happy to talk with you about it and anything that we can do to help with conservation of this species. So with that, I appreciate your attentiveness and hope to see you out on the trail of ravens with the conservation of this good species.
Well, that was a very interesting presentation, and I've always wondered the difference between crows and ravens. So that made it actually very nice to be able to see that in here. So that helps out a lot.
Well, certainly if you see them from a distance, it could be really tough to tell. So yeah, it was a great segment. Yeah, unfortunately, Zach could be here with us to take any questions, but we do have Dr. Springer and Andrew Berry with us. They may know a little bit if there are some questions related to ravens.
Exactly.
But a big thanks to Zach for that.
Speaking of Andrew Barry, I think hopefully we got him back. We're experiencing some rain, some thunderstorms going on in the area, and so it's wreaking a little bit of havoc with our internet.
Yeah, so it does cause some challenges, but Andrew's going to give it the old college try and try again here. So,
so Andrew, if you want to go ahead and try doing your presentation, there you are.
Okay. Yeah.
hey, welcome back.
Hey, thank y'all for having me. Sorry about that. It looks like the rain moved through, so I think we're going to get a little window here for
All right.
All right, that'd be good.
presentation. Okay, well, let me share screen and we'll get going with this. Okay, so again, I am Andrew Barry. I'm the Director of Conservation at Bernheim Arboretum and Research Forest. Bernheim is about 16,140 acres. It's located in the Knobs of Kentucky. And so the title of my presentation today is The Knobs of Kentucky. We're just going to talk about the region, a little bit of history about it, some of the natural features of it, some of the plants and animals, and some of the threats that also it faces as we move forward in the century. So let's just get rolling. A little bit of intro about Bernheim. Again, as I mentioned, we are a 16,000 acre forest just south of Louisville. We were founded in 1929 by a fellow named Isaac Wolf Bernheim, who was a bourbon distiller. He came over in the 1860s as a German Jewish immigrant, worked his way up through the ranks and became one of the more prominent bourbon distillers in the history of Kentucky. Really, his greatest legacy, though, was leaving an endowment and the land into the Isaac W. Bernheim Foundation that we manage today for connecting people with nature. We do that in a lot of different ways. We certainly have a lot of visitors that come through our gates. We stress nature-based education, both informally and through formal programs with schools and adult education. We do a lot of arts in nature. So we're well known for the forest giants that a lot of people come out to see, but we've got a lot of other exhibits throughout the Arboretum, and even sometimes even into the natural areas. This one is Earth Measure, which is a giant limestone piece, which I kind of think is kind of like our Stonehenge there at Bernheim. We protect a lot of water. We've got 91 miles of streams. We've got 73 water bodies and wetlands throughout Bernheim. Just an incredible aquatic resource for the region. And we're not just all forest. We've got over 300 acres of prairies in various stages of succession that we manage for open habitat, for pollinators, for birds. And then, of course, the forests. Bernheim Forest is just an incredible place. You know, we've got a lot of variation within our forest, as I'm going to talk about throughout this presentation. You know, the knobs have a lot of different geological layers and a lot of different aspects and features that make for a diverse forest and a diverse plant community. And then wildlife. You know, of course, Bernheim is kind of a draw for wildlife because we are large as a forest, and we're also a refugia. You know, we're a protected area where a lot of species such as golden eagles, which I presented on a few weeks ago, find refuge. And lastly, I do want to plug one of our upcoming events. You know, if you haven't been out to Bernheim and you want to come experience an event, Connect is coming up on September 10th. It's something that goes from about 4 o'clock to about 10 o'clock at night. So it's from the late afternoon into the evening and then after dark. It's a combination of nature, arts, and science. We've got music, we've got arts events, we've got hands-on programs. It's just a great chance for people to come out and experience Bernheim in the evening too, when a lot of people don't get to see it. So let me jump into the presentation on the knobs now. And, you know, the knobs has always been a fascinating region for me. Growing up, we have a farm in Mercer County, and while we weren't in the knobs, from one of our hilltops, you could see the knobs in the distance out there in Boyle County. And it always fascinated me. And so as I started to learn more about Kentucky and understanding the role that the knobs play, you know, really surrounding the bluegrass region, you know, from several places within the bluegrass, if you look out, you're going to see those knobs on the perimeter. And defining the knobs region is not always so straightforward. You know, some people think that parts of the Appalachian Plateau might be in the knobs. Some people think that the knobs are the Appalachian Plateau. And it varies from the east to west side for sure. Looking at a better map that I think really shows the natural regions of Kentucky well, this one is from the Kentucky Nature Preserves Commission, and it shows the natural regions of Kentucky. And you can see the knobs right in here in this light blue as this band that stretches around the bluegrass. You know, it really just encircles it. It includes, you know, everything from southern Louisville, from the Jefferson Memorial Forest, on through Fort Knox, down through the Bardstown area, all the way across Marion, Casey, Taylor County. And then when you get into the eastern side of the knobs, places like Berea, which are really well known, Estill County, and then on up into the Bath County region and all the way up to Greenup. It's a long stretch. It's defined by a couple of prominent features such as Muldrows Hill, and then bordered by the Pottsville Escarpment on that eastern side too. You know, I always describe, people say, well, what are the knobs? I say, well, in general, they're bigger than a hill and smaller than a mountain. And actually what they are is they've been described as hills of denudation, meaning that they weren't formed by uplift, they were formed by erosion. And that's erosion over the geological layers that formed during the time when Kentucky was a shallow sea. So in this diagram right here, you can see kind of an exaggerated knob of what it looks like, where you've got the Silurian limestones and the Devonian geological layers, and then that's capped by the Mississippian formation on top. So you go from limestones in the lower elevations all the way up to a sandstone, siltstone in the higher elevations. And it's that geological diversity that really lends to a lot of richness in terms of the biodiversity, the plant communities. And, you know, it's just really an incredible place to be able to see all of those zones at the same time. So in terms of history, you know, the knobs really, you know, it's a term that's really closely related to Kentucky, although Indiana does refer to their area as knobs too. And really Kentucky knobs extend up into Indiana. But, you know, they're well known for, you know, a lot of reasons, including Daniel Boone, of course, when he came across Kentucky and into the bluegrass region. It is said that he first viewed the bluegrass from up on Pilot Knob. Pilot Knob is located near Clay City. It's a prominent point. It's a state nature preserve now that you can actually hike up and get that same view that Daniel Boone had looking out across the bluegrass. Of course, a lot of people associated with Abraham Lincoln. He spent the first 8 years of his life living there in the Knobs, and there's now a national park around his boyhood home on Knob Creek. So a nice little cabin there, and that's a great visit if you're in that LaRue County, Nelson County area. And then there's a long history of industry. You know, of course, a lot of people associate the forest with the Knobs as being one of those resources that help to build and make Central Kentucky what it is. Of course, the bourbon industry, Louisville, Lexington, they all depended on that timber that was coming out of the Knobs. And it did things like feed the iron furnaces, which popped up around the edges of the Knobs. There was also iron ore that was mined, and this was in the early to mid 1800s. By the late 1800s, the railroad had caused the iron industry in Kentucky to drop off. But one of the industries that's still going strong that is based around the Knobs is the bourbon industry. And the reason there are so many bourbon distilleries around the Knobs is because of the springs that emerge. Really high quality limestone springs that come out from that Silurian Devonian interface in that geological layer that supposedly makes some of the best bourbon and whiskey in the world. So as I mentioned before, Bernheim is a large forest, 16,140 acres. But all around Bernheim and throughout Fort Knox and the Knobs, there's some pretty expansive tracts of large forest left. You know, throughout the bluegrass, the inner bluegrass, the outer bluegrass, you know, a lot of that forest was cut and converted over to agriculture. And then a lot of those species that were originally found in the bluegrass, they all found refugia and headed up into the Knobs region. You know, there's still a lot of prairies and glades interspersed throughout the Knobs. There's a number of rare plants and animals associated with the glades, things like the Eggleston violet, and a number of other prairie species, particularly throughout the western knobs. And you also get this just wonderful mosaic of forest and agriculture kind of intermixed and coexisting. The forests of the knobs themselves, they have a really nice composition. As I mentioned before, in the lower levels, you've got kind of your beech maple and poplar forest. In this image here, you can see the poplar just starting to green up in these lower elevations. But then as you work your way up higher, you get into the oak forests. You got a nice mix of Virginia pine in some of those uplands, but really it's the white oak and chestnut oak forest which dominates in those uplands. And that's pretty unique in terms of the central Kentucky area around Louisville. You're mainly only going to find those white oak, chestnut oak forests in the upper regions of the knobs. And so it like I said, it acts as a refugia for imperiled species. So outside of Appalachia, the Appalachian Plateau, when you get into central Kentucky and the western part of the state, it's within these high knob elevations, the sandstone, siltstone that caps them, where you are going to find the expansive white oak forest, but you're also going to find species like blueberries in the understory, stuff you don't expect to find in central Kentucky. You're going to find other imperiled species like the yellow nodding lady's tresses. You're going to find interesting species like the mountain lover, which is found in the knobs around Berea. This is Pachystoma cambii. This is one of those glacial relic species that only exists now in some of those rugged outcrops on top of the knobs. But you're also going to find refugia for species like the imperiled bats. The northern long-eared bat is one in particular, which is decreased throughout its range substantially, almost found nowhere, in MissNet surveys throughout the state of Kentucky. We do still find these bats within Bernheim, along with the Indiana bat and some of these other tree roosting species, or the ones that form maternity colonies within loose bark and mature trees. The northern long-eared bat is still hanging on, and it's those large forests that these bats look for and come to Bernheim and other knobs areas in summer. And we also find that the knobs acts as a corridor, which allows some larger species such as the black bear to make forays out into central Kentucky. So it's been pretty steadily over the last decade, this time of year, July, August, September, that we get reports of black bear that are coming into Bernheim area, Marion County, even up into Jefferson County and crossing the river over into Indiana. And they're coming along those knobs corridors. So as you look out in this image here, looking towards Knob State Forest, you can see, that there's still quite a bit of forest land, still quite a bit of natural connectedness between these large forest tracts, but there are definitely some threats. If you head south on I-65 from Louisville these days, you'll notice that there's a lot of change going on. Land use change is it's part of growth within our communities, but it also oftentimes damages and disconnects some of these natural areas that we're trying to protect around Bernheim. So as you head down I-65, things like the warehouse expansion along I-65, we're seeing those things cut into the knobs. We're seeing forest loss, but we're also seeing some of the knobs being used as fill material for siding warehouses and also other construction projects. So when those knobs are lost, that we also lose their ecosystem function. We lose those climate mitigating effects. We lose the biodiversity. And that's something around Bernheim that we're focused on trying to protect. And so raising awareness around that and fostering opportunities to protect knobs forest before it's gone is something we're heavily invested in. As I mentioned, a lot of expansion of warehouses, heading down I-65 around Bernheim that are threatening some of our natural areas and certainly disconnecting us from other protected areas. These warehouses are feeding that retail internet boom. A lot of packages are being shipped out of there and heading up to Louisville Airport. And so it's something that, while it's not exactly being built on the knobs, like I mentioned before, a lot of these knobs are being cut down and used for fill dirt as bases for these warehouses as they fill in those floodplains. And then the effects are felt throughout the knobs. There are definitely some climate impacts from those warehouses. And so climate change, it's something that we're focused on at Bernheim over the coming century. We know that the knobs around Bernheim and throughout Fort Knox provide a lot of climate benefits for the greater Louisville area and for Central Kentucky in broader context. Things like mitigating extreme temperatures, things like creating clean air, water, sequestering carbon, protecting biodiversity, providing clean water downstream for the communities. There's so much that these large forests do, and keeping them around and making sure that we protect their services for the ecosystem is really important. So I'm going to wrap up with a couple of places that I should suggest that if you all want to get out and take a trip to the knobs, it would be a great place to experience them. Again, from Louisville or Lexington, it's just a short trip of 30 minutes to get into the knobs region. Pilot Knob Nature Preserve is really a great place to check out. If you head down the Mountain Parkway towards the Red River Gorge, you're probably aware, of that drive as you start to approach it, and you really start to see those knobs pop up when you get out there near the Clay City area. So Pilot Knob, again, it's a protected state nature preserve. It's a short hike to the top, but it's just incredible views up there. I also want to recommend Berea Forest, the Pinnacles area, and all throughout there. That's just a great place to visit. It's a great town that is set there in the knobs too. So check that out. That's probably one of my earliest recollections of going to the knobs, was going there to Berea Forest with my parents. And then also places like Claremont, Kentucky, where Bernheim is, and also Jim Beam Distillery is there with their visitor center. That's a classic, iconic knobs town. And then take a trip on down the Bourbon Trail to Bardstown, which is also a great community there in the knobs. And then Bernheim is always a great place to visit in the fall. Fall color should be kicking in late October. We have Color Fest this year, which is a little bit later in early November, but that's a great chance to come out and check out Bernheim and see the knobs for yourself too. And so that concludes my presentation on the knobs region. It's just a fascinating area of Kentucky. It's a great backdrop for the bluegrass, and if anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that presentation. We greatly enjoyed it. Yes.
Yeah, good stuff, Andrew. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad that you got to make your presentation and the storms kind of went through. We were wondering there for a little bit. But
Me too.
Yeah.
It's stressful.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you did good. You did good. You muscled through it. So thank you for sure.
Yeah, at the beginning I was talking about all the diversity Kentucky has, and you showed a lot of that diversity. So Kentucky is just a vast state of a lot of different things. So
it's what makes it so cool, I think, really.
Exactly.
A lot of different habitats, a lot of different species, and a lot of cool things to see in the state.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, it doesn't look like there's any questions, so it looks like you answered everybody's whatever questions they may have had. So we appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll have you on again. Thank you.
Yeah, appreciate you.
I'll stay on if anything comes up. So thank you all.
All right,
yeah,
wonderful.
big thanks to you and Bernheim for sure. Yeah. Oh, we learned some cool stuff today, Renee.
We really did. Yes. We've been talking about this diversity, and we just seem to end up showing it over and over and over again about how diverse Kentucky really is.
Yeah. Yeah, again, it's one of the things I love about this state.
Mhm.
There's just a lot of different things to see and enjoy. So, if you're a woodland owner out there, we encourage you to be good stewards of your property and
Mhm.
get connected with people who can help you, and start out at your local county extension offices, and then make your way to the Kentucky Division of Forestry and Fish and Wildlife. There's just a lot of people out there that really want to help you get the most out of your woodland property. So make sure you reach out. And if you don't know how to reach out, let us know and we'll make those connections for you.
Exactly. And right now we have a Kentucky Woodland Owner short course going on. We had some webinars. We only have one of those left, but we
Yep.
still do have the field tour in Pennyrile.
Yeah, that's a good
Okay,
point,
too.
Renee. We do have the Kentucky Woodland Owner Short Course ongoing. As you mentioned, there's one more live webinar tomorrow night. However, if you were interested in joining and you wanted to maybe get out to Pennyrile State Forest, we do have some openings there. Our Berea College Forest trip is already booked, so we're full up there, which is a great problem to have. But unfortunately, that means we can't take anybody else there. But if you are interested, check us out online, and you can watch the recordings of the other ones, and then you can join us out at Pennyrile State Forest.
Definitely. So learn some more about that diversity, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's all we have for today, folks. We greatly appreciate you joining us. And if you ever want to figure out, you're like, oh, what did they say about those ravens or those knobs? You could go to fromthewoodstoday.com, and every show we've ever done is right there. We say you could binge watch us if you want to.
You could spend, you can spend a few weeks just watching our shows if you
You
wanted.
really could.
But thank y'all for being a part of it, and please let others know about it. It's a great resource. We believe we're bringing in natural resource experts from across the state, talking about issues that are important here to us in Kentucky.
Yeah. Speaking of which, if there's an issue that's important to you, also on that fromthewoodstoday.com, there's a survey, and you can click on it and let us know if there's a topic. We have been known to show topics that have been requested. So
No doubt. There's some cool stuff out there. If you see it, take a picture and send it in. Something you've maybe not seen in your woods before. We might try to feature it on a future episode.
Exactly. All right. Until then, take care, and we will see you next week at 11.
Bye everyone.
From the woods today.